Hello and welcome to another fun-filled edition of Adam's Music Box, where today Greece is the word, or is it bird? No, that's the 60s. But today we're going to talk about the 50s and the 70s and the strange relationship between two decades that really couldn't be more different from a socio-political point of view in both the US context and in the wider Western world, so-called. So, the 70s was a decade in which people became obsessed with the 50s, which kind of seems weird because that would be like people in 2024 obsessing about 2004. But maybe it's because the 50s and the 70s represented a more profound and defined change in terms of arts, in terms of politics, in terms of society, than 2004 vis-a-vis 2024. So let's just look at some of the differences. In the 1950s in the United States, fuel was cheap and plentiful. In the 70s, there was a gas crisis. In the 1950s, it was generally acceptable, at least in many parts of the US, to express openly racially derived bigoted views, where in the 70s, pop culture and even mainstream culture tended to shun that kind of thinking. Now, a lot of racism continued below the surface as it does today, but there's a strong argument that can be made that the 70s was in many ways the most tolerant decade that we've had since the civil rights revolution of the 60s. It is something to talk about. Don't underplay how people did in many ways come together in the 70s, certainly more than before, in some ways more than since. So that was another difference. Consumer electronics was becoming Japanese, where in the 1950s it was all American. There were other changes too. Fashion went from being very buttoned down to being let it all hang out. And you can see the changes even in politics. In the 50s, who was the American president? General Dwight Eisenhower, a war hero, a man who could do no wrong. Who was the president in the 70s? Well, there were a few. There was Richard Nixon, who left office before being thrown out. There was Ford, who was generally considered unmemorable, and there was Carter, who was generally considered a failure. Again, a huge contrast. And so it was against this backdrop that the culture of the 70s tended to turn to the 50s. And this was particularly true in terms of musical revival. Now, 70s music is obviously very different than 50s music, but bands that were reviving 50s music became very, very popular. Sha Na Na, which started in the late 60s, arguably had their most success both on tour and on television in the 70s, and that gave way to a George Lucas film, American Graffiti, which was kind of seen as a celebration of 1950s Americana. And then by the end of the decade in 1978, there was Grease, a kind of over-the-top high school love story that was a bit of cornball, but maybe that's what people needed. Because remember, film in the 1970s in general was anything but corny. Film was tended to be hyper realistic, very dark in terms of the moods and even in terms of the cinematography styles. Gone were the bright open landscapes of 50s and 60s epics, and here was a more intimate style of film. Think Chinatown, think The French Connection, think The Godfather, think Apocalypse Now. Even Family Guy made fun of this when there was a man who gets shot after leaving a library, and then the camera zooms out, and Stewie goes, "Ah, it was a 70s movie." So Greece, much like a lot of the other 50s revival material of that time, tended to show a contrast to what was going on in the 70s. It was as if to say, yeah, we're living in this post-Nixonian, post-Vietnam recession, inflation, gas crisis laden world, but we are getting along better than before. Culturally, things are much more interesting in some ways than they were before. But at the same time, wouldn't it be nice to take the best parts of the 50s, the innocence, and yes, there was stuff below the surface, but the innocence on top of the surface, the prosperity and all of the rest of it, and just have sing-songs about it. And Greece definitely served that purpose, arguably even more than American graffiti bands like Sha-Na-Na or other 50s revival bands, because there were quite a few in the 70s, Sha-Na-Na just being the most well-known. And Greece is still popular today, even among people who aren't really into music of the 70s, because Greece was 70s music made to sound like the 50s. And I think the reason is because a decade like the 50s will always hold a special place in the heart of people that are searching for stability and fun simultaneously. Because the 50s society was stable, at least mainstream middle class society, and things were generally prosperous, certainly compared to the 70s. And in the 80s, even when the economy recovered, the prosperity was less evenly shared than it was in the 50s. And that's been the story of everything. The 80s was good if you were in the upper echelon of the middle class, not if you were an unemployed factory worker. The 90s was great if you were investing in a tech company, not so good if you were competing with industries being destroyed by NAFTA. And then came the recession after 2001, the recession of 2008. And here we are with gas prices being far, even adjusted for inflation, worse than they were in the 70s. So if that doesn't make you want to listen to some Grease and just forget about it all, I don't know what will. And that is one of the reasons this soundtrack and film were so popular. So Grease is the word today and probably tomorrow too. Like, subscribe, and we will see you next time. Take care.